Welcome to part 3 of Learning Unit 4, Week 10. So we're going to pick up our discussion talking about the functions of curriculum. So we mentioned earlier that one of the things that curriculum developers and curriculum planners need to do is figure out what the purpose of the curriculum is. And so part of determining what the purpose is determining the function of the curriculum. So what function will it serve? And at the institutional level, the school level, you can think of it as, there are a few different functions that curriculum can serve. And so the first is this common or general education. And so you can think of this as a set of, the minimum competencies that people need to be actively engaged citizens, successful, responsible participants in their society. And so this, you can think of the discussion we've had in the past about cultural literacy. So what are the things that all people need to know to participate in a meaningful and successful way in the society? What's that common knowledge that people need? What kind of outcomes and experiences should all learners have in common? So this really doesn't consider the idea that anybody would be a specialist or has any kind of unique gifts or talents that need attending to. So this is really just what's the this function of curriculum would be, what is it that everybody needs to get out of the curriculum. So another function that curriculum can serve is supplementation. And so this is, unlike the common or general education, this is where the idea of individuality comes into play. And so in a supplementary curriculum or supplementation, serving a supplementation function, the curriculum can deal with kind of the unique characteristics, gifts, or talents that individuals have, or some of the deficits that learners bring to them. So, a GATE curriculum would be a supplementation curriculum, and let's say curriculum that you developed as part of your response to intervention, or a remedial curriculum would be an idea of a curriculum serving a supplementation function. So exploration is another function that curriculum can serve. And so if you were developing a curriculum to serve this particular function, this would be the idea that learners can, rather than kind of going through and learning just the general knowledge that everybody needs to know, this is the type of curriculum where people can, or learners can kind of discover and participate in inquiry and figure out the things that interest them. So they kind of develop their own personal interests here. Kind of less formal here, not as structured, and what it can allow a learner to do is try things out and figure out, what are those things that they are not just interested in, but may have a particular talent for, and what things they do not have any particular talent or interest in. And then that last function would be specialization. And so if the curriculum is serving a specialization function, it serves to develop some type of specialization in the learners or the students themselves. So this could be a curriculum centered, like a vocational curriculum centered on a particular trade or a profession, or it could be around an academic discipline. So if you think about some of the curriculum in magnet schools that cater to, some of them do like pre-med or specialties in math and science, but the idea that the curriculum that they provide is going to serve this specialization function, and so it's going to be above and beyond in developing the expertise or the skills needed, kind of above that common or general education that most students will need. All right, so once you've kind of gone through all those considerations about purpose and function, you eventually have to get to the point where the curriculum developer determines what is going to be taught. And so there are a couple of different models that people or curriculum developers use for making those types of decisions. And so we're going to cover what are considered the rational and the technical models. And we're not going to cover all of them in depth because we are really going to use or focus on just one of them. So the needs assessment model is the one we're going to discuss now. And a needs assessment model is one that is actually used quite commonly to make the decisions in curriculum planning. In terms of curriculum and curriculum development, a need is defined, or McNeil defines it as the discrepancy that exists between the acceptable state of learner achievement and the observed. So, there's this desired outcome, which is the acceptable or kind of the minimal standard that's created, and then there's actually what people observe to be happening, and there's a gap in there, and so that gap then becomes the need. So people or curriculum developers and boards of education and those involved in any kind of policy making or curriculum development like a needs assessment model because intuitively it makes sense. So it's when you want to make changes to a curriculum or you want to introduce a new curriculum, it's easy to justify the changes that you want to make or this new curriculum by identifying this perceived need and coming up with a solution for it. And if you really think about any process that people go through, people like the idea of finding a deficiency and coming up with a plan to solve it. And that's what essentially a needs assessment model does. So there's several steps that curriculum developers go through in a needs assessment. And so one of those first steps is that they have to identify the actual needs and set those priorities. So in this step, the curriculum developers want to think about what outcomes do they want from this curriculum. And so depending on the curriculum orientation, those needs are going to be different. So if you are developing a systemic or an academic curriculum, obviously the outcomes that you're going to be looking for are going to be related to performance in the identified areas, so in math and science and social studies, etc. If you're coming from a more social reconstructionist orientation, your outcomes might be something like equity or social justice. And so then the needs that you identify are going to look much different than the needs that would be identified from a systemic or an academic curriculum framework. So the curriculum developers identify this set of outcomes that they want, and they write goal statements that address these outcomes that they have identified. And the assumption is that these learning outcomes and these goal statements would reflect the values, the needs, and the wants of all of the stakeholders. So that would be the teachers, the community, anybody involved in the curriculum development, that all of those needs would be considered when writing those goal statements. So once those statements or outcomes have been identified, there's usually some sort of process for the curriculum developers or the group that's working on it to prioritize these. And so sometimes they can ask groups of teachers, parents, students, community members to go ahead and rank them in terms of priority. Sometimes it might be just members of the group, but they have some kind of process that's going to go ahead and take that list that they've identified and order or rank it for the purposes of determining what they're going to include in the curriculum and what they're going to focus the most time on. All right, so like I said, formulate this working list of goal statements, and then you go through some type of process to assign priority and ranking to them. The next step is to set that student performance threshold for the objectives within the goals. So you take the outcomes that you want from the curriculum and they turn them into goal statements. And then from there, you need to set some kind of determination for where we would like students to be. So what is kind of that minimum competency line? So whether it is in terms of social justice or equity outcome, what is that kind of minimal line of acceptability? Or if we're talking about academic performance, where is that, minimum competence threshold. And then once they identify that piece, they want to measure it against the actual performance. And then that gap, like we said before, becomes the need that's identified. So in terms then of developing the curriculum, you kind of have to have a little bit of balance here, because when you're looking at the different, objectives or outcomes that you want in terms of where you want to be and where you actually are, you would assume that the ones that have the widest gap or the biggest gap would indicate an area for the biggest need. But when, once you identify those, you look at which ones are the biggest need in terms of that list you made before and what folks deemed to be most important or, of the greatest priority. And so then you can revise that ranking based on, what the data says after that, or sometimes, the gap may be real wide, but it doesn't necessarily mean that now becomes a priority, because you still want to go back to that list that you had before. Excuse me. So then once those, identified needs have been identified and the goals have been identified, these become the basis for the actual curriculum plans. So you can go ahead and you can revise those outcomes and those goal statements, and then the actual, learning activities and teaching strategies and ways that you're going to assess and evaluate can be developed from this point. Right. So a needs assessment model, it's, sounds like a very kind of technical, structured way to make decisions about curriculum. But as many of us probably work within a curriculum that was somewhat determined on a needs assessment model. They don't always, fulfill their promises, or the process itself isn't always as cut and dry as it seems. And so one of the criticisms or the problems within that is the idea of the actual goals themselves. So standards in some way have helped to take care of this problem, but in some way they haven't, because often the goal statements, it's very easy for them to be very vague. And so if you're going to take those goal statements or those needs that have been identified and you're going to actually translate them into action, they need to not be vague, because then that leaves for big discrepancy and probably little chance that gap that was identified or that need that was identified is actually going to be filled or fixed. One of the other issues that comes up is the idea of that measurement to identify the need. And so, you've got this threshold that they set for, the minimum competency, and then, what students are actually doing. And that's how you identify that gap. But sometimes actual performance, or the way that we're going to measure the actual performance, isn't the best measure. So sometimes it's just observed performance. And so the data in terms of observation can be really subjective. And so you're identifying a need that might not really exist or be of that much importance. And so then if you think about the implications, an entire curriculum is going to be modeled on perceived needs. And so these might not be actual needs. And so then all of the learning outcomes and objectives that are developed based on perceived needs might not actually deliver what folks are looking for in terms of why they're developing or planning this particular curriculum. Right. So another, I would say, less commonly used model for decision making is the futuristic model. And so not one we're going to spend a ton of time on. And so I'm actually going to end us here, and we'll pick it up on screencast 4 and go over it quickly.